Everyone has heard of Patton, but almost no one has heard the full story of what his soldiers actually did to the Germans. The official history talks about tank breakthroughs and lightning advances across France. It talks about relieving Bastogne and racing to the Rhine. But there is another layer to that story. A darker, stranger, more unsettling layer that the textbooks quietly skipped over. And it starts with a question that German officers kept asking after the war, long after the guns went quiet and the interrogations began. They didn't ask about Patton's tanks. They didn't ask about his artillery or his air support. They asked about the men who moved through the dark like they belonged there. The men who didn't fight the way European soldiers fought. The men who came from places where survival itself was the first lesson you learned before you ever picked up a rifle. If you want to understand why German generals described certain American units as something worse than any conventional military force they had ever encountered, you have to go back further than World War II. You have to go back to a world that existed long before the war in Europe was even imaginable. You have to go back to the Apache. And before we go any further, if this kind of deep, buried military history is what you're into, the stories that never made the headline textbooks, then stay with this, because we are just getting started. The Apache people had been at war longer than most nations have existed. Not the organized, structured, set-piece warfare of European tradition, but something far older, far more instinctive, and in the eyes of those who faced it, far more terrifying. For generations before any American general ever studied at West Point, the Apache had been mastering a form of combat that had no rulebook, no formal doctrine, and no mercy when mercy wasn't warranted. They fought in the mountains of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. They fought against the Spanish, against the Mexicans, against the United States Army, and against rival tribes. They fought in terrain so brutal that the U.S. Army, one of the most powerful military forces of the 19th century, spent decades trying to pacify a group that never numbered more than a few thousand warriors and still couldn't fully do it. The reason the Apache were so difficult to defeat wasn't just bravery, it was methodology. The Apache concept of warfare was built entirely around the idea of asymmetric combat, long before that term existed in any military manual. They didn't meet you on open ground. They didn't give you a target you could shoot at. They moved at night, when visibility dropped to nothing. They used terrain as a weapon, positioning themselves in places where an enemy's numerical superiority meant absolutely nothing. They could cover 40 miles on foot in a single day, through desert and mountain, without carrying the kind of supply train that would slow a conventional army to a crawl. They could survive in environments where other soldiers simply died. They knew how to disappear. They knew how to appear suddenly, strike with devastating precision, and vanish before the enemy could organize a coherent response. They understood psychological warfare in a way that most military theorists of the time hadn't even begun to think about. Fear was a weapon. Uncertainty was a weapon. The sense that you were being watched, that something was out there in the dark, that you couldn't see, but that could see you perfectly. That was perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. When the United States Army finally began to get control of the Apache situation in the late 19th century, they didn't do it by outfighting the Apache. They did it partly by recruiting Apache scouts to help them, because the Army's leadership, or at least the smarter elements of it, recognized something important. These men knew things that couldn't be taught in a classroom. They knew things that couldn't be written in a field manual. And those things had military value that was almost impossible to quantify. Fast forward to the 1940s. America is at war on two fronts simultaneously. The military is absorbing millions of new soldiers and trying to train them as fast as possible. And somewhere in that enormous, chaotic process, a handful of people in the Army's leadership began thinking about something that most of their colleagues would have considered absurd. They began thinking about what happened when you put men from warrior cultures, men who had grown up with a fundamentally different relationship to danger, violence, and survival, into a modern military context. What happened when those ancient skills met 20th century weapons and tactics? The answer, as German officers would later describe it, in remarkably candid terms, was something that defied easy categorization, something that went beyond the normal vocabulary of military analysis, something they struggled to explain not because they lacked the words, but because the reality of what they had encountered didn't fit neatly into the frameworks they had been trained to use. To understand what the Germans faced, you first have to understand the specific units and the specific men involved. Native American soldiers served throughout the American military during World War II. Approximately 44,000 Native Americans served in uniform during the conflict, a disproportionately high number given the overall population. They came from dozens of different tribal nations. They served in all branches and in all theaters. But certain concentrations of Native American soldiers in certain units, particularly those that operated under Patton's Third Army, developed reputations that went far beyond anything their numbers might suggest. The story of the 45th Infantry Division is essential here. The 45th had a complicated, layered history. It had been organized from National Guard units in Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Its early insignia was a yellow Thunderbird on a red background, later changed to a red Thunderbird on a yellow background. The Thunderbird wasn't chosen arbitrarily. A significant percentage of the division's soldiers were Native American, drawn from the tribal nations of the American Southwest and Great Plains: Creek, Cherokee, Seminole, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Kiowa, Comanche, and yes, Apache. These weren't men who had been pulled off farms or out of factories and handed a rifle. Many of them came from traditions where the relationship between a man and the natural world, between a warrior and his environment, was something cultivated from childhood, not as a hobby or a cultural affectation, but as a fundamental survival skill. They had grown up learning to read terrain, the way a city kid learns to read traffic patterns. They had grown up understanding how sound travels at night, how wind direction affects scent, how to move through broken ground without disturbing it in ways that could be detected. These were not things they had to learn in boot camp. These were things they already knew. The 45th went through North Africa, then into Sicily, then into Italy, and finally into southern France as part of Operation Dragoon in August 1944. And it was there, fighting northward through France and eventually into Germany itself, that certain patterns began to emerge in German after-action reports that would later puzzle military historians who stumbled across them. German officers and soldiers who were captured and interrogated repeatedly described the same experience in strikingly similar terms, regardless of where or when they had encountered these particular American soldiers. The descriptions weren't about firepower or equipment or even tactics in the conventional sense. They were about something harder to define, about the sense that certain American units operated in a fundamentally different relationship with the battlefield than anything they had trained to fight against. One German officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had fought against the Soviets before being transferred to the Western Theater, was asked, after his capture in 1945, what had surprised him most about fighting Americans. He didn't talk about Sherman tanks. He didn't talk about American artillery, which was genuinely world-class and terrified German soldiers across every theater. He talked about night patrols. He talked about finding positions that should have been secure had been penetrated without a single sound, without a single alarm being triggered. He talked about soldiers who seemed to have a physical relationship with darkness that went beyond training, who seemed to belong in a way that European soldiers, German or otherwise, simply did not. Another captured officer, this one from an SS division that had engaged elements of the 45th in the brutal fighting around Anzio and later in France, described what his men had called the ghost soldiers. He used the word unheimlich repeatedly. It's a German word that translates roughly as uncanny or eerie, but it carries a heavier weight than either of those English translations suggests. It implies something that violates the expected order of things, something that feels fundamentally wrong in a way you can't quite articulate. That was the word he kept coming back to, unheimlich. These soldiers were unheimlich. What specifically were they doing that produced this reaction? That requires a careful look at both the tactical specifics and the broader context in which they operated. Patton's approach to warfare was built on speed, aggression, and the relentless application of pressure. He famously said that a good plan executed violently now was better than a perfect plan executed next week. But within that broader framework of fast, hard, aggressive movement, there were requirements for a different kind of soldier. someone who could gather intelligence in the dark, someone who could infiltrate enemy positions, identify weaknesses, create confusion, and disappear before the enemy could respond effectively. These were the roles that fell disproportionately to units with high concentrations of Native American soldiers, partly by design and partly because word traveled through the military hierarchy about what certain men were capable of. Apache soldiers in particular brought a specific set of skills that translated directly into these roles. The traditional Apache approach to scouting, which had been refined over generations of conflict in some of the harshest terrain on the North American continent, emphasized a level of environmental awareness that most military training programs of the time didn't even attempt to develop. It emphasized patience, the ability to remain absolutely still and silent for extended periods of time while maintaining complete situational awareness. It emphasized reading sign, the subtle environmental cues that indicated human presence, movement, and activity. It emphasized movement discipline, the ability to move through terrain without leaving traces that could be followed. These skills, applied to the European theater, produced effects that German soldiers found deeply disorienting. The German military was extremely competent, arguably the most technically sophisticated military force in the world during the war years. Their doctrine was excellent. Their training was rigorous. Their tactical innovations, particularly the stormtrooper tactics, developed in the First World War, and the combined arms integration that characterized Blitzkrieg, had set the standard for modern warfare. German soldiers were trained to fight effectively, in darkness, in bad weather, in difficult terrain. They were not easily frightened or easily confused. And yet these particular American soldiers frightened and confused them in ways that their training had not prepared them for. The issue wasn't simply that the Americans were good at night operations. The Germans were good at night operations too. The issue was the degree of comfort, the apparent ease and naturalness with which certain American soldiers operated in conditions that even highly trained European soldiers found stressful and disorienting. The darkness that created uncertainty and anxiety for a German sentry seemed to create no such anxiety for the Apache soldiers moving through it. The terrain that slowed and exhausted German troops conducting night patrols seemed to have no such effect. The environmental cues that a European soldier might miss entirely were apparently being read and interpreted and acted upon in real time. One particularly striking account came from a German NCO who had served on the Russian front, survived Stalingrad, and fought in France before being captured in late 1944. He was describing a nighttime infiltration of a position his unit had held. The Americans had come through a dense forested area that the Germans considered an impassable natural barrier. They had positioned machine gun nests and wire to cover the obvious approaches. The forest was not an obvious approach. It was steep, heavily wooded, covered with deadfall and undergrowth that would make silent movement essentially impossible for normally equipped soldiers. Except that it wasn't impossible. The American soldiers had moved through that forest at night, in total silence, and had appeared suddenly at the rear of positions that were oriented entirely in the wrong direction to meet them. The German NCO said, and this is paraphrased from the translated interrogation transcript, that his men had not heard anything. Not a twig snap, not a boot on rock, not breathing, nothing. And then suddenly, these men were there, among them, and the chaos that followed was absolute. He said something that stuck with the American intelligence officer conducting the interrogation. He said it was not like fighting soldiers. It was like being hunted. That word, hunted, came up repeatedly in German accounts of encounters with these particular units. Not ambushed, which implies a tactical action that fits within the normal framework of military operations. Hunted, which implies something more primal, something that bypasses the rational, trained soldier brain and speaks directly to whatever part of human consciousness is still connected to the ancient, instinctive fear of the predator in the dark. To understand why that particular fear was so effective, you have to understand the psychology of the German military situation. By 1944 and 1945, German soldiers were under enormous strain. They were fighting a two-front war that had already consumed enormous resources and manpower. They were facing a strategic situation that senior officers already understood was probably unwinnable. They were operating on reduced rations, reduced ammunition, reduced air support, reduced everything. Morale, while still remarkable by almost any historical standard, was under constant pressure. In that context, the psychological dimension of facing an enemy that seemed to operate by different rules, that seemed to inhabit the darkness with a comfort and capability that defied normal military experience, was devastating. Fear compounds when you don't understand the source of it. When you know you're facing tanks, you dig anti-tank positions. When you know you're facing artillery, you build better bunkers and disperse your positions. When you know you're facing night infiltrators, you set up listening posts and trip flares and overlapping fields of fire. But when the soldiers you're facing can neutralize those countermeasures with an apparent ease that your training told you should be impossible, the fear doesn't go away. It grows, because you don't know where the limit is. You don't know what these men can't do. And this is where the Apache heritage became not just tactically relevant, but psychologically devastating, because the reputation preceded the reality. Word spread through German units. Stories circulated, as stories always do in military environments, about these American soldiers who moved like ghosts, who appeared from impossible directions, who seemed immune to the normal constraints of terrain and darkness. The stories grew in the telling, as such stories always do, and by the time a German unit was in a sector where these soldiers operated, the men were already primed for fear before a single patrol had gone out. This is a phenomenon that military historians call the shadow of reputation, and it is a genuine force multiplier. The Apache warriors of the 19th century had understood this instinctively. Part of what made the Apache so difficult to fight wasn't just their tactical capability. It was the reputation that capability generated, the knowledge that they were out there, in the mountains, watching, waiting, capable of striking anywhere at any time without warning. That knowledge degraded the performance of their opponents, even when no actual contact was occurring. The same mechanism was operating in the forests and hills of France and Germany in 1944 and 1945, transferred across a century by men who carried those traditions in their blood and their bones. Patton himself was aware of the particular value of these soldiers, though his awareness expressed itself in characteristically Patton-esque terms. He was not a man given to nuance or anthropological sensitivity, but he understood battlefield effectiveness with a clarity that few commanders in any army have ever matched, and he understood that certain men in his command were doing things that his conventional doctrine didn't fully account for, things that were producing results that exceeded what their numbers and equipment should have been able to produce. There is a well-documented story, repeated in several accounts from soldiers who were present, of Patton watching a briefing about the activities of a particular unit that had been conducting deep penetration patrols well behind German lines. The briefing officer was describing the patrols in standard military language, talking about infiltration routes and intelligence gathered and positions identified. Patton apparently stopped him at one point and asked a simple question. He asked how many men had been on the patrol. The briefing officer told him the number. Patton was quiet for a moment, and then he said something to the effect that he didn't care how they did it. He just wanted more of it. That was Patton's version of a compliment, and from him, it carried enormous weight. But to tell this story properly requires going deeper into specifics, into particular actions and particular men, because the broad outlines of the history only get you so far. The real texture of what happened, the thing that explains why German officers were still talking about it years after the war ended, lies in the specific details of specific engagements. Consider the situation in the Vosges Mountains in the fall of 1944. The Vosges are a range of mountains in northeastern France, running roughly parallel to the Rhine, and forming a natural barrier between the Alsace Plain and the French interior. They are forested, steep, and in autumn and winter, bitterly cold, with limited visibility. They were also, in the fall of 1944, extremely heavily defended. The German command understood the strategic importance of holding the Vosges passes. If the Americans broke through, the path to the Rhine and into Germany itself would open up. The fighting in the Vosges was some of the most brutal of the entire Western European campaign. The terrain negated American advantages in armor and air support. It was infantry country, close and ugly and unforgiving. And it was in this environment that echoed in certain respects the mountain terrain of the American Southwest, that Native American soldiers in general, and Apache soldiers in particular, began to display capabilities that stood out even in a theater full of remarkable soldiers. Patrols operating in the Vosges during this period routinely returned with intelligence that should have been impossible to gather. They penetrated positions that German commanders had assessed as secure. They moved through terrain at night that German units considered impassable. They disrupted German logistics and communications in ways that seemed out of all proportion to the size of the forces involved. One particularly documented instance involved a patrol that spent 3 nights behind German lines, moving through forested mountain terrain in near-zero visibility, gathering intelligence on German positions, identifying artillery emplacements, mapping defensive lines, and returning without losing a single man. The intelligence they brought back enabled subsequent operations that broke through German defenses in a sector that had been holding for weeks. The German soldiers in that sector, when they were eventually captured and interrogated, had no coherent account of how the Americans had gathered the intelligence they clearly possessed. They had not detected the patrol. Their listening posts had not heard anything. Their dogs had not alerted. Their trip flares had not been triggered. The Americans had simply been there, seen what they needed to see, and been gone. And the German soldiers, when told that a patrol had spent 3 nights in their position, reacted with a combination of disbelief and something that the interrogating officer described as genuine, unfeigned fear. Not fear of what had happened, but fear of what the fact that it had happened implied about what these men were capable of. The use of Apache scouts and trackers within the broader context of Patton's army extended beyond nighttime infiltration. These skills translated into an almost supernatural ability to read the ground, to determine from physical evidence not just that an enemy had been present, but how many of them, when they had moved, which direction they had gone, what their state of readiness had been, what they were likely to do next. This kind of tracking was not a standard skill in the American military of the 1940s. It was not something that could be quickly taught or reliably learned. It was something that required years of development in environments where the stakes of getting it wrong were real. Apache soldiers who had grown up tracking game, tracking water, tracking the movement of other people through desert and mountain terrain, came to the European battlefield with a developed perceptual skill set that their fellow American soldiers, regardless of how well trained they were, simply didn't have. And the way that skill set expressed itself on the battlefield was something that German military intelligence, for all its considerable sophistication, had absolutely no framework for analyzing or countering. There is an account from a German intelligence officer who was tasked with analyzing the pattern of American patrol activities in a sector where Apache soldiers were operating. He was trying to understand the logic of how these patrols were choosing their routes and their timings. He had extensive experience analyzing Soviet patrol patterns on the Eastern Front and felt confident that he could identify the operational logic that would allow him to predict future patrol routes and set effective ambushes. After 3 weeks of analysis and 2 failed ambush attempts, he reported to his superiors that the patrol patterns he was seeing did not conform to any doctrine he was familiar with. They were not random. He was certain of that. The intelligence gathered was too consistently valuable to be the result of random movement. But they also did not follow any of the predictable patterns that formal doctrine produced. They seemed to be following something else, something he couldn't identify, possibly terrain logic, possibly something related to natural patterns of animal movement, possibly something cultural that he had no way of accessing. He recommended that a specialist in Native American cultural practices be consulted. He did not explain why. He didn't need to. The recommendation itself tells you everything. The German High Command did eventually produce an assessment of the unusual tactical characteristics displayed by certain American units in the Western Theater. This assessment, portions of which have been translated and analyzed by military historians in the decades since the war, identified several specific capabilities that exceeded what German analysts expected from American infantry. The ability to move at night through difficult terrain with a speed and silence that outpaced any doctrine-based prediction. The ability to gather detailed tactical intelligence from close observation without triggering detection. The ability to maintain operational effectiveness under conditions of extreme environmental stress, cold, rain, poor visibility, rough terrain, that degraded German unit performance significantly, and what the assessment described as an unusual psychological resilience, a difficulty in inducing the kind of fear and uncertainty that normally accompanied effective German night harassment tactics. That last point is particularly revealing. German infantry units were skilled at using darkness and uncertainty as psychological tools. Night raids, harassment fire, sudden appearances and disappearances designed to keep enemy soldiers exhausted and anxious. These were standard elements of German tactical doctrine, and they worked against most opponents, because most people, regardless of their training, have a deeply embedded instinctive response to threat in darkness that produces anxiety, reduces sleep quality, degrades decision-making, and over time significantly reduces combat effectiveness. But against these particular American soldiers, those tactics were not producing the expected results. The German assessment noted with evident puzzlement that units reported attempting standard night harassment actions against certain American positions and receiving responses that indicated not the anxious, degraded performance they expected, but something that looked more like heightened alertness and immediate, effective counteraction, as though the darkness itself was not a stressor for these men, as though it was, if anything, an environment in which they were more, rather than less effective. One German officer put it more bluntly in a captured personal diary. He wrote that fighting these Americans in the dark was like being a cat that discovers the mouse is not actually afraid of you. It is disorienting in a way that is difficult to describe. You expect fear. You plan for fear. When it isn't there, you don't know what to do next. The cultural roots of this go deep. The Apache approach to darkness was fundamentally different from the European approach, not because Apache people were biologically different, but because the cultural context in which Apache children grew up included a different relationship with night and with fear. The Apache did not encourage fear of darkness. They trained it out. Young men learning the warrior traditions spent time in darkness deliberately, learning to read it, to inhabit it, to understand it as a tool rather than a threat. By the time an Apache warrior was fully trained, darkness was not a domain of anxiety. It was a domain of advantage, because experience had taught that the man who is comfortable in the dark has an enormous advantage over the man who is not. Transfer that cultural preparation to a European battlefield in 1944, mix it with genuine military training and modern weapons, and you get something that existing military doctrine had no category for. Something that German officers, drawing on extensive combat experience against a wide range of opponents, including the notoriously tough Soviet infantry, described in terms that suggest the encounter went beyond normal military experience and into something that touched older, deeper fears. The Apache soldiers themselves were rarely given to dramatic self-description. Accounts from veterans of these units tend toward the understated, the practical, the matter-of-fact. They were doing what they knew how to do, moving through terrain the way terrain should be moved through, paying attention to what the ground and the air were telling them, being where the enemy didn't expect them to be. These weren't mysterious skills to them. They were simply skills, things you learned because they were worth knowing. But the effect on those they were fighting against was something else entirely. There is a pattern that runs through German accounts of these encounters that deserves explicit attention because it illuminates something important about the nature of what was happening. German soldiers were describing encounters with American forces that produced in them something beyond tactical stress, something that sounds, in the language they used, much more like the kind of fear that has psychological and even primal dimensions. The word hunted came up repeatedly, as noted earlier, but so did other revealing terms, words that implied something other than the normal vocabulary of combat. One German officer described the feeling in his unit after several nights of encountering these patrols as similar to what he imagined soldiers of an earlier century felt when fighting enemies who seemed to operate by different laws. He did not elaborate on what he meant by different laws. He didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. This connects to something that military psychologists have written about at length, the particular fear generated by an enemy that you cannot predict using the frameworks you have been trained to use. Against a conventional enemy, even a very good one, Your training gives you tools for managing fear. You know the patterns. You know the doctrine. You know what to expect, even when what you expect is bad. The uncertainty is bounded. But against an enemy who doesn't follow the patterns, who seems to operate from a different set of rules entirely, the uncertainty is unbounded. And unbounded uncertainty is psychologically catastrophic in ways that even extreme conventional danger is not. The Apache soldiers, without necessarily intending to produce this effect, were generating it constantly, simply by operating naturally within their own traditions. The movement patterns that to them were simply common sense, the route choices that to them were simply reading terrain, the timing decisions that to them were simply responding to environmental cues. All of these produced from the German perspective an enemy that was genuinely unpredictable in a way that exceeded anything their training had prepared them for. And Patton, whatever his flaws as a human being, was brilliant at recognizing and amplifying things that worked. He didn't necessarily understand why these soldiers were doing what they were doing at the cultural level. He didn't need to. He understood that they were producing results that exceeded what he could get from comparable numbers of conventionally trained soldiers in certain specific tactical contexts, and he used that understanding to push them into exactly those contexts, again and again, in the grinding advance through France and into Germany. The record of what the 45th Division and other units with significant Native American representation accomplished in the Western European theater is documented in official histories, in division records, in after-action reports, and in the interrogation transcripts of captured German officers. Taken together, these sources paint a picture of military effectiveness that goes well beyond what numbers and equipment alone would predict. They paint a picture of soldiers who brought something to the battlefield that couldn't be manufactured in a training camp or replicated through doctrine, something that had been developed over generations in environments where the cost of failure was absolute. There is a dimension to this story that goes beyond tactical history, though, and it would be dishonest to tell the story without acknowledging it. The men who served in these units came from nations and peoples who had been subjected to a century and a half of policies explicitly designed to destroy their cultures, their languages, their traditions, and their identity. They had been relocated from their ancestral lands. They had been subjected to boarding school systems specifically designed to separate children from their cultural heritage. They had been impoverished, marginalized, and legally stripped of rights that other Americans took for granted, and yet they served in disproportionate numbers. They fought with extraordinary effectiveness. They brought to the defense of a nation that had treated them with consistent brutality the very skills that nation had tried to eradicate. The Apache warrior tradition that German officers found so bewildering and so frightening was precisely the tradition that American assimilation policy had spent decades trying to eliminate. The skills that made these soldiers so effective on the battlefields of France and Germany were the skills that had been passed down in defiance of policies explicitly designed to prevent their transmission. The reasons individual Native American soldiers chose to serve varied enormously. Some felt a genuine patriotic attachment to the United States, despite everything that had been done to their people. Some were following warrior traditions that made service in conflict a matter of honor regardless of the political context. Some were responding to economic realities that left military service as one of the few available paths. Some were moved by the specific horror of fascism and what it represented. Many carried complex mixtures of all of these motivations. But whatever their individual reasons, what they brought to the battlefield was real, and its effects were documented in the records of the enemy they fought against, in terms that those enemies never would have chosen to use about an adversary they didn't respect on a profound and genuine level. German military culture in the Second World War era was thoroughly permeated with a particular ideology about racial hierarchy. It is one of the more striking historical ironies of the period that German soldiers and officers, products of that ideology, found themselves writing and speaking in terms of genuine professional respect and something very close to genuine fear about soldiers from a people that Nazi ideology placed near the bottom of its twisted hierarchy. The reality of who these men were and what they could do on a battlefield completely demolished the fantasy, but it took actually fighting them to accomplish that demolition, and by then, it was too late for the insights to do anyone any good. The legacy of what these soldiers accomplished didn't disappear with the end of the war. It went underground, partly, the way so many inconvenient histories do. The official narrative of the Western European campaign emphasized conventional operations, armor, logistics, strategic bombing, the great set-piece battles of Normandy, and the Bulge and the Rhine crossings. The quieter, stranger story of what happened in the dark, in the forests, on the night patrols that German intelligence officers couldn't explain. That story got filed away in interrogation transcripts and captured enemy documents that took decades to fully analyze and contextualize. But the U.S. military itself took notes. The experience of Native American soldiers in World War II contributed to the development of special operations doctrine in ways that aren't always explicitly acknowledged, but can be traced through the evolution of American special operations thinking in the post-war decades. The recognition that certain skills related to environmental awareness, movement discipline, patience, and the ability to operate effectively in conditions of extreme stress and limited visibility were genuinely rare and genuinely valuable, contributed to an expanded understanding of what small unit operations could accomplish. That expanded understanding eventually expressed itself in the Special Forces, in Ranger Doctrine, in the broader evolution of American light infantry capability that would play out over the second half of the 20th century. The Navajo Code Talkers, perhaps the most famous specific example of Native American contribution to the American war effort, have received significant historical attention. Their story is genuinely remarkable and genuinely important, but it has, in a sense, allowed the broader story of Native American combat effectiveness to remain underexamined. The Code Talkers used a specific cultural heritage, their language, as a specific tactical tool, and the clarity and comprehensibility of that contribution made it easy to document and celebrate. The contributions of Apache soldiers and other Native American warriors in infantry and reconnaissance roles were more diffuse, more embedded in the normal flow of combat operations, and correspondingly harder to isolate and analyze. But they were no less real and no less significant. The German officers who talked about these soldiers after the war were not being diplomatic. They were not offering praise because it was expected of them. They were offering assessments born of direct experience, sometimes at enormous personal cost. Some of these men had lost soldiers under their command to the actions of these patrols. Some had watched defensive positions they had carefully prepared be rendered useless by men who moved through the terrain in ways that should have been impossible. When they reached for words to describe what they had encountered, they reached for words that went beyond the normal vocabulary of military analysis, because their normal vocabulary didn't cover it. The phrase "worse than hell" appeared in multiple forms in multiple accounts, sometimes directly in captured documents, sometimes paraphrased in interrogation reports. It is a striking phrase from men who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had experienced artillery barrages that turned the ground into a continuous explosion, who had survived conditions that would have been unimaginable to most human beings in the history of warfare. For those men to reach for that particular comparison when describing infantry soldiers conducting patrols in the forests of France says something important. It says that what they encountered went beyond the normal dimensions of military threat into something that touched a different register of experience entirely. Hell, as a concept, implies something not just dangerous, but disordered, operating by rules that you cannot predict or counter, existing outside the normal framework of comprehensible cause and effect. That is precisely what these German officers were describing when they applied that language to these American soldiers. Not just effective opponents, not just dangerous opponents, opponents who seemed to operate by different rules, rules that they could neither understand nor effectively counter. The Apache warrior tradition had always understood this. The greatest tactical advantage is not superior numbers or superior equipment. It is operating by principles that your opponent cannot understand. If your opponent cannot understand how you are doing what you are doing, he cannot effectively counter it. He cannot predict where you will be. He cannot prepare for what you will do next. He is always reacting, always off balance, always uncertain. And an opponent who is reacting, off balance, and uncertain is an opponent who is losing, regardless of what the numbers say. This is a principle as old as warfare itself, but it requires a kind of cultural preparation that cannot be replicated quickly. You cannot teach a man in a few weeks of training to have a relationship with darkness and terrain and the natural world that someone else developed over a lifetime, shaped by a warrior tradition stretching back generations. You can teach him techniques. You can drill him in procedures. But the deep instinctive competence, the thing that allowed Apache soldiers to do what German intelligence officers couldn't explain, that is not a technique. It is something that lives in a person, at a level below the level that techniques reach. Patton understood this at a practical level. Even if he wouldn't have expressed it in those terms, he understood that certain men in his command had a quality that his conventional doctrine didn't produce and couldn't replicate. He used that quality aggressively, the way he used every advantage he identified. He was not a man who wasted assets, and these soldiers were assets of a kind he recognized instinctively, even if the cultural dimensions of what they represented were largely invisible to him. The broader context of Native American military service in World War II includes not just the specific tactical contributions, but the broader pattern of disproportionate participation. Approximately 10% of the total Native American population served in the military during the war, compared to approximately 12% of the total American population. A gap that is remarkable given the specific disadvantages Native American communities faced in terms of health, education, and access to the kind of physical conditioning that military service required. In some communities and some nations, the participation rate was considerably higher. The Lakota, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, communities with deep warrior traditions, sent their young men to the war in numbers that reflect something more than just economic necessity or legal obligation. They reflect something about the relationship between those traditions and the concept of the warrior's role in the community, a relationship that survived a century of policies explicitly designed to destroy it. The Apache specifically, having been the last major Native American military force to be fully suppressed by the United States Army, as late as 1886, with the final surrender of Geronimo's band, brought to the battlefields of Europe a warrior tradition that was in some respects the most recent, the most fully developed, the most completely adapted to the specific conditions of asymmetric conflict in harsh terrain. Geronimo himself, the most famous of the Apache leaders, had eluded the full military force of the United States Army for years, with a tiny band of warriors in terrain that the Army found nearly unnavigable. The descendants of those warriors, 3 and 4 decades later, brought the essence of what had made that evasion possible into a new context, with new weapons and new strategic stakes. And German officers who had never heard of Geronimo, who had no framework for understanding the cultural and historical background of what they were encountering, who were simply trying to do their jobs in an increasingly desperate military situation, found themselves writing in their reports and diaries, and later saying in their interrogations, that these particular American soldiers were like nothing they had encountered before, like something out of a different world, like something that belonged to a different category of threat than the one their training had prepared them to handle. One of the most telling documents from the period is a German tactical assessment prepared in late 1944 and recovered after the war. It analyzed specific incidents in which German defensive positions had been penetrated or bypassed or simply rendered irrelevant by American patrol actions that the document characterized as following no recognizable doctrine. The assessment recommended a series of countermeasures, improvements to listening post protocols, modifications to perimeter defense layout, adjusted patrol schedules to prevent the establishment of patterns, all sound tactical recommendations. And then it concluded with a paragraph that stuck out among the dry tactical language, like a rock in still water. It said, in translation, that in addition to these measures, commanders should be aware that the unusual effectiveness of certain American infantry elements may derive not from superior training or equipment, but from cultural factors that conventional military analysis is not equipped to assess. It recommended further study. It did not specify what form that study should take or who should conduct it. The war ended before anyone had a chance to figure it out. That final paragraph, buried in a captured German tactical document, is perhaps the most honest thing anyone on the German side wrote about the experience of fighting these soldiers. It is an admission that the framework they were using to understand what they were seeing was insufficient. It is an acknowledgement that there was something at work that exceeded their analytical capacity. And it is, in its way, a profound tribute to the men it was written about. Those men came home after the war, as veterans do, to a country that had not resolved the contradictions in its treatment of them. Native American veterans returning from World War II still faced legal discrimination. They still couldn't vote in some states. Their communities were still impoverished. The boarding school systems that had tried to eradicate their cultures were still operating. The skills that had terrified experienced German officers were still being treated by the broader American society as remnants of a culture that was supposed to have been assimilated out of existence. Some of those veterans went on to play important roles in the Native American civil rights movements of subsequent decades. Some returned to their communities and became elders and teachers, passing on the traditions that the schools had tried to take from them. Some struggled with the same difficulties that afflicted veterans of every background: the transition from the intense reality of combat to the ordinary demands of civilian life. Their stories, like the tactical history of their service, have been less told than they deserve. But the German documents don't lie. The interrogation transcripts don't lie. The captured tactical assessments don't lie. And what they say, collectively and consistently, is that these soldiers were among the most effective individual combatants of the entire Western European campaign, that they produced in their opponents an experience that went beyond tactical stress into something approaching genuine psychological destabilization, that they operated in ways that the most sophisticated military analytical apparatus of the time could not fully explain, and that the source of this extraordinary effectiveness was not just training, and not just equipment, and not just individual courage, though all of those were present. The source was something older and deeper and more specifically rooted in who these men were and where they came from and what had been passed down to them across generations of a warrior tradition that the country they were fighting for had spent a century trying to destroy. The Apache warrior, in the person of these soldiers, in these forests, in these winters, achieved something